Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is already the 31st of January in Russia and Ukraine, and we're looking at really interesting updates with the Battle of Andriivka now heating up. The Russian forces have been able to get an even larger foothold in that town. We're also going to look at the unfolding battle for the Pokrovsk perimeter, while then focus on Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. We'll finish off with Verkhovno and I want to discuss a new decree by Zelensky that will disband 4 or 5 brigades that were in the process of formation. And it really goes back to the entire saga of the 150 series of brigades that we've been talking about for the past 2 months or so. So let's zoom in and begin with Andriivka. And as we do that, please like and subscribe so we can grow the channel. Over, you can see that the Russian forces have restarted their advances north of Rozdonia after a long intermission due to forces being redeployed elsewhere, but also due to Ukrainian resistance. There's been stiff resistance from the 23rd Mechanized Brigade. This unit over here, they've been targeting Russian deployment points and staging groupings within the town itself, but that was not enough to stop this current gain by the Russian side, amounting to 8.45 square kilometers of territory. It is a significant advance through a largely open area that is located on relatively high ground. Really, everything that is sort of sandwiched in between this valley, which is just running along the Vavcha River, and then to the west over here, the Mokriali River is on higher elevation. So I'm just gonna mark it for you guys pretty vaguely over here. You can see that's generally where you have the higher elevation. It extends from where the Russians are located northwestwards all the way to the outskirts of Kamar, where the Ukrainians are. At this point, the Ukrainians don't have many actual settlements along this high ground, but they do have just open fields and anti-tank ditches. The Russian forces are the ones that are now going to be able to use those positions to further exert pressure on the flanks of numerous Ukrainian logistical points, most notably Kamar, and that will be a Russian target going forward. But right now, a lot of this movement by the Russian side is aimed at reaching the highway connecting Kamar to the group being near the front line of Andriivka, likely in Konstantinopil. So it is about cutting off that sort of front line resistance. So you could see the Russians increasing efforts over there. They've also been able to chip away at some of the remaining open fields in the Dakhny pocket, as we refer to it. And in the process, they captured 3.1 square kilometers of territory. This is based on footage from the 37th Marine Brigade of FPV strikes targeting Russian soldiers either on foot or approaching on motorcycles in the direction of Ulakli to the northwest. And at this point, the Ukrainians do lack over here any solid base of defense in terms of just organized settlements or even a really well-defined trench line. I'm sure there are dugouts in some of these tree lines, but they're not even going horizontally at this location. They're going vertically, meaning they're not going to be as effective against Russian motorcycles that are advancing directly northwards through a vertical area. They're going to be able to bypass a lot of those physical boundaries. And so, more generally, this region is unprotected. And the only way to sort of keep the uh, Russian forces out and to prevent any sort of infiltration on the rear is through deployment of reinforcements into dangerous areas in combat zones or to just increase the amount of FPVs in the air. And that's not foolproof. Now, over here in Dakhny, this is the area where the Ukrainians did actually have a bit of a linchpin that was able to protect their holdings to the west. But now you can see that it is largely in a gray zone or under Russian control. And over the past 24 hours, they've been able to capture this eastern chunk of the town. So now the fighting is really getting sort of shifted towards the western parts of Dakhny, including these warehouses in some of the residential areas and duplexes. You could also see over here that east of Andriivka, the Russian forces have been able to make some significant gains. I'm estimating it at 4.5 square kilometers of territory, but once you take into account the fact that there is this entire swath of open fields, tree lines, and also just very dense amount of trenches that were supposed to protect the entire northeastern perimeter of Andriivka, all of them now probably no longer with a Ukrainian known presence, and they're in my eyes in a gray zone right now. Eventually, they'll be taken over. And that's like another 5 square kilometers of territory, which will give the Russians a very, very strong base that is no longer just this sort of outlying salient, but just an entirely newly fleshed out position that will be able to exert enormous pressure and entrance forcibly into Andriivka from the northeast. And you could see how it's being done along this road, for instance. There's also the route through the road from Shevchenko, which is not being used that much at the moment, but could definitely be unlocked if the Russians can sort of pin down their position over here near this fortress and just push the Ukrainians south of the Orlova River, because the Orlova River is one of those other natural barriers in this location. It is pretty narrow, and in a way, it does negatively impact the Ukrainians because it does disrupt for them the ability to move from the front line to the rear, to move north and south, and to also, of course, deal with the fact that they're located on lower elevation as a result of all those river valleys. But in any case, I want to show you guys that there's a geolocation over here. This is from the 152nd Brigade. They're now deployed to this region. If you recall, this Jaeger Brigade was previously located on the sort of like eastern perimeter of Pokrovsk, in an area where right now you have the 93rd Brigade, 25th Air Assault Brigade. So generally with that grouping of forces, and that was basically the first area that it was deployed to since it was created and then sent to the front line around the sort of final quarter of 2024. We're going to get to it in a second in the sort of addendum to the 155th Brigade video that I made. And so now they've been moved over here, and this was a conscious choice by the Russian or Ukrainian high command, because even though the defense of the eastern parts of Pokrovsk is highly critical, they are nonetheless being shifted to this location because the situation in Andriivka is now becoming pretty dire, and there needs to be immediate stabilization measures, or else Andriivka will also face a similar fate to many other towns that were not able to mount successful defensive operations. Just to name a few, Krakow, Velika, Novosilka simply did not have the sort of longevity that other Ukrainian defensive nodes in clusters did have in previous times over the past half year, like Selidove, just to give a recent example. But over here, it's an issue for numerous reasons. First of all, Andriivka is located on that lower elevation that the Russians just completely are able to outflank and overlook from their positions located west of Slovyanka and Petropavlivka. As you said before, the logistics are highly complicated by the rivers and the roads that are on lower elevation. And also, Andriivka just lacks depth, not even mentioning the fact that the only strong trenches are to the north, and half of them have already been taken over by the Russians. But just once you enter into Andriivka, there's not that much to take over. It is a pretty small town, all in all. It's not really rivaling in size when it comes to like the amount of houses, the amount of basements. It's not really rivaling some of these other larger populated towns that we've been looking at in previous months. And so now that the Russians have a foothold over here, they're going to have similar experience with these similar populated villages, and it won't be that much of a challenge in relation to those other battles that they've already heavily engaged in with sometimes even stronger and even more numerous Ukrainian forces, depending on the case. But over here, you could see that the Ukrainians are aware of the fact that there is a potential for the Russians to very quickly get into the center of the town. And that's why they've redeployed at least one brigade to this region. And it's just mainly other territorial defense brigades besides that fact. And we have to clarify the situation with some other units like the 72nd Brigade, which should be floating around here, but we haven't just heard from them in a while. And if they were over here, then they would be a very important addition to the defense of the town. But as you can see, the Russians now have this very strong position, which will expand even further soon. And it's just located east of Andriivka, meaning that any sort of Ukrainian localized counterattacks won't have the same sort of sway that they had a couple of weeks ago when they were able to keep the Russians at bay near the sort of like western approaches of Shevchenko. Now the fighting has really shifted several kilometers westwards, and we're already at the gates, and in some cases within the houses already, of Andriivka. This is also admitted by Ukrainian sources that claim that the Russians have been able to take over the first streets in these eastern districts. And so we're going to see how that battle unfolds over the coming days. This will now become one of the main focuses of the channel as the battle moves forth. I think that the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade is one of the key units involved in this, just based on their previous locations, along with the 1454th Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment. And they're mainly doing it on foot. It's not necessarily being done with armored columns. There just hasn't been a record of that recently, and we could just also see that from the Ukrainian FTV videos where they're striking those individual Russian soldiers, further backing up the proof of Russian advances. Now over here, based on Ukrainian claims, the Russian forces have been able to capture 0.7 square kilometers of territory along the tree line directly west of Novoandrivka, and now they are once again getting closer and closer to Sribny. and doing so directly to the east of the town, not necessarily flanking it in this case. We'll have to see how the Russians decide to go about overrunning that village. Then in Nadivka, the Russian forces were able to capture a small chunk of the southern portion of this town. And you could see that on January 27th, the 59th Brigade, which is still operating over here, they conducted FPV and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers that were advancing through this location. Again, there isn't much of an attempt to flank from the north because of the density in defenses, and then to the south, it's probably because of the deployment of Ukrainian forces in a nearby region, whether it be Srebny or Priobjevchenko. And so just the Russian troops over here that also aren't that numerous, because we're talking about pretty small size of villages, and we're looking at many different clashes going on at the same time. They're just focusing on clearing out the populated regions, the basements, the warehouses, wherever there are Ukrainian positions, is trying to overrun those locations. And then at the same time, also accompanying that with an advance to the north, where you do have these Ukrainian built up regions that the Russians are looking to take out of the equation. Now, when it comes to Uspanivka, the Russians have not been able to force themselves into the town in earnest. The Ukrainians have been able to hold on now for like 3 weeks or 2 weeks against really significant odds, and it's sort of similar to what happened in Novovasilivka previously, and it's largely being done by the 59th Brigade. I think probably one of their battalions is engaged in this defense. So now the Russian forces are trying to come in from the south and hook them in. So the Russians captured 2 square kilometers south of Novovasilivka. There was no way the Ukrainians would be able to succeed in holding on to it, because it is just completely an open area, and Russian troops just asserted themselves there, and it won't be that much more difficult to continue a couple hundred meters westwards through additional open areas and then flank Uspanivka from the south, because the biggest issue for this town is that it is just so disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison, and it's almost like an island surrounded by these large open areas where there is a vacuum to be filled, because there aren't Ukrainian troops located and holding on to dugouts or trenches in these open fields, meaning the Russians have the option to move in. And for them, the biggest concern is just to avoid getting struck by an FPV drone. But on a grand scale over a couple of days or even more sometimes, that's not going to be enough to shift the scales in Ukraine's favor and permanently prevent the Russians from reaching a certain location. That's just not feasible, although it could just increase Russian attrition rates in those regions. In Udachne, there is a possibility that the Ukrainians counterattacked, that they were able to retake parts of the rail line and reach back into this production facility, but I'm still not sure if that's true. I'm basing this off of a video from the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, a unit that previously was operating in Toretsk, but for a couple of months now, I've just not seen proof of them operating there. I just vaguely knew they were there, and I hadn't seen proof to the contrary. But now we're finally seeing that they actually have been redeployed, and I get why to a certain degree. Toretsk at this point has become an understanding. There's an understanding when the Ukrainian high command that they have lost that city, and now the sort of intensity of operations is shifting, as now it's not an urban battle anymore. It's still very important because you need to protect Konstantinivka, as we'll look at in a second, but you don't need as many men to fill every single apartment block. And so now this unit is being moved to another critical area, which would be Udachne, and they came under very heavy fire upon being deployed to this region based on geolocations. They were in the eastern part of Udachne, and they're trying to, if they haven't already, counterattack, because after the fall of Vodachnia and the mine factory, there really aren't any other nearby defensive positions, and the Russians will have this sort of open access besides the fields themselves, obviously, to expand through these huts to Surhivka, to the border with Dnipro. I've been warning about this constantly, and that's why the Ukrainians are now putting an emphasis on either counterattacking or moving in reinforcements to these locations. Now, to look at the Toretsk region, I believe that's where we have the next set of updates. You can see over here that the Russian forces have been able. Here you can see the Russian capture of the eastern part of Cherchibinivka, amounting to almost 1 square kilometer of territory in total. This comes as an expansion of previous Russian advances near the center, or I would say more so the western part of the town, really running along the rail line. And now they've been able to expand eastwards and take over many other residential areas, leaving only this one final northern block under Ukrainian control, which sort of acts as a conduit between the rear, which would be all of these other houses that are running along the rail line to the north and also along the Toretsk River, and then southwards, where there still remains this uh, final Ukrainian salient. It's basically a pocket by now. Imagine the sort of fire back that you have to go through to get in and out of this place. But nonetheless, there are still Ukrainian troops that are resisting over here. There is a possibility that in the coming days there will be reports of a full Russian capture here, because some Russian sources are beginning to discuss that. Then now this pocket is actually getting closed, but I'm not sure yet, so I'm just going to exercise some caution. But as you recall, the Russians are fighting against Ukrainians in the water filtration plant, the car racing track, some of the houses in Zabalka, and then also this mine peak over here. So that is important to keep in mind. But besides that, really nothing else on the perimeter of Toretsk. The Russians are solidifying their presence on that perimeter and looking to make moves to take over some of the nearby locations where the Ukrainians are now staging in. There are a couple of notable examples that I can just highlight with my cursor for you guys. And also, it is a part of planning more generally for the next stage of operations over here, which will intrinsically be tied to the fighting in Chasiv Yar, also culminating in Konstantinivka, but that's already looking into the longer term picture. I will talk about that in more detail if there is actually a yearning for that. But over here in Chasiv Yar, you can see that the Russian forces have been able to capture another 1.2 square kilometers of territory through this dense forested region, reaching the local pond and reaching some of the quarries. There's a chalk quarry over here that the Russians recently took over. All in all, they're just getting closer and closer to the actual populated areas where there are houses. And there's also just a dense network of paved and unpaved paths. And then eventually, if you move east, or I would say west enough, you reach this area over here, 1 kilometer to the southwest. And that's an entire district of like eastern Mykolaiivka, where you do have some Ukrainian defensive density, and you do have houses that have to be overrun in order to secure the entire network of villages over here. This network of villages is sort of rural in nature, and it's sort of difficult because the geography is pretty rugged, and there are a lot of ups and downs and sort of peaks over there. So it is a difficult area to move through and operate in, but it is on the road to Konstantinivka as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, the Russian forces have continued to make inroads in the center of Chasiv Yar based on Ukrainian reporting, and now they also control a bit more of this apartment complex. They were able to take over the Avanhard Stadium and a couple of private one-story residential areas. Now, to finish off, I want to look at Verkhnokamianske. You can see this village over here. The Russian forces previously claimed control over it, and we talked about the sort of scandal associated with that, because you had this incident where like the Russian command over here, the local command, they were fabricating stories about breakthroughs and then relaying it to the media in order to give the false image that they were achieving success that they actually weren't. And that was supposed to just give them like good favor and give them just brownie points, you could say, with the higher ups. So those people were charged criminally and removed from their posts. And now you actually have a Russian entrance into Verkhnokamiansk from the east. This occurred on January 29th. This is from the 6th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the key units involved in this location. I really hope I can find them, their icon placed over here on the map. But regardless of that, yeah, over here, they attacked from the south with a couple of armored vehicles running along this tree line, and then they dismounted forces using grenade support, dropping grenades onto from drones onto Ukrainian forces deployed over here, and then were able to take over the basements and whatever remained of those houses. So now you have the battle of for this village really in full force, as the Ukrainians would like to at least maintain control over the center and western parts, because now the Russians have access to this sort of paved road running through the center of the town, which is then the connecting point to reach the outer ring of Seversk. So that is important, and would see us actually get some movement in the Seversk front for the first time in a couple of months now. When it comes to the brigade structure that I was talking about, Zelensky gave the order according to Ukrainian military journalist Yuri Betosov, and he wrote a really, really good article just going through the history of the Ukrainian army structure in terms of recruitment of certain forces and the way that all the units are organized. And really an important point is that due to his public pressure campaign, where he shined the light on the individual stories of certain brigades that were created in the latter portion of 2023 and then also the beginning of 2024, that played a huge role in influencing Ukrainian public opinion and the opinion of Ukrainians in the Rada, in media, and all of that together, just like that entire confluence of pressure, is what eventually pushed Zelensky into making the decision to uh, disband essentially the units that were already in the process of formation. There were five of them, so we'll just name them out for you guys and know that they will not actually come into fruition. So we're looking at brigades number 158, 159, 160, and 162. I'm going to click on them here so you can see. This is 158. Here's 160. 159 is this one, and then 161 and 162. 161, I don't actually know if that was disbanded, but it probably was. It just wasn't explicitly mentioned. And then 162, it doesn't even have a logo, so I can't even find like a record for it out there in the ether. But it was theoretically supposed to be created, and I think it was supposed to be deployed in the Zhytomyr region over here. But now, of course, that will not occur. And just imagine, according to the Butусov, a lot of these new brigades, the ones that are in the 150 series, and there are about 8 or 9 of them that currently are deployed to the front line and engaged in heavy combats. They initially had sizes of between 5 to 7,000 men. That is absolutely crazy because when you think about it, a lot of these actual experienced Ukrainian units that have a large core, they're closer to 2,000 right now due to attrition rates and not receiving the proper amount of reinforcements. And then you have these new units that are completely bloated and have between 5 to 7,000. Most of them not being trained. Some of the like initial ones actually did have a core of trained elements, and then those were sort of chipped away at by the Ukrainian side by their more experienced brigades. And so then you're left with a situation where basically every single company is made up of new recruits, and it's very, very difficult to build up a solid base for that sort of units because they just don't have any reference points. It's completely understandable. And then at a certain point, when you make so many units, you run out of experienced commanders, and then you have to start promoting people that don't deserve it, people that aren't ready for that task, people that are corrupt. The list sort of goes on, and those sorts of issues they begin to compound. But it indicates to us that over the 2024 period, ever since the April mobilization law was passed, the Ukrainians were able to actually mobilize a pretty large amount of people, and that they were able to add them into many brigades. But just imagine if they were just immediately added into experienced brigades and definitely needed that sort of additional supplement instead of having this sort of weird workaround where they were first deployed to certain brigades without training and without proper drone equipment, for instance. I won't rehash what I say every single video, but then get deployed immediately to the front line and then get chipped away at, in certain cases, by other units. So it's just sort of like this really unnecessary and redundant and sometimes very deadly middleman in between the initial deployment phase and then other units that definitely need them, taking away those new Ukrainian recruits. And so Zelensky's understood it at this point, and he's saying that the new brigades, the 5 new brigades that were supposed to be created, which could have amounted to 25,000 new men if they were at full strength, they will now just be sent into existing units. You also have the 156th Brigade, which is a unit that is currently in past the stage of formation. It's already been created and already has men. It's not going to be disbanded. It's actually going to be sent to Europe, and it'll be the final Ukrainian brigade in this series of 150 that will be created and deployed to the front line. And so it will come back from training, and then it will join the other units that are fighting, like 153, which I think trained in Germany. 157, it's currently deployed as well to the front line. It engaged in the Battle of Kurakova and is now deployed in the Andriivka region. They had a huge scandal and a massive story that was also explained by Butусov. I really wanted to cover it because a couple of days ago it was a big story, but I didn't get the time to at the time. But just know that they suffered very similar fates to 155th Brigade when it comes to the lack of training, the lack of drones, issues with Bradleys breaking down almost immediately and not getting spare parts, issues with brigades being chopped up and then just broken up and taken over by other units. Just very similar stories with every single one of the brigades, and then the common theme of just not or sort of subpar commanders. I would put it that way, and a lack of training as a collective. They received individual training, the ones that were in Europe and the ones that weren't, but they never really received the sort of group training needed in order to create a strong, cohesive base for operations. And so that's just an overview of my points. And you will have the 9 remaining brigades that were already created and fighting on the front line. They will stay there. and they will continue to be used to fill up holes in those key parts of the front line. But the 5 new ones that were supposed to be created, they will not be created after all, and no new ones will be formed for the time being. What will happen though is probably a lot of the smaller units that are currently assault battalions or regiments, they will be promoted over time and will eventually become brigades, because they will prove themselves using experience and attracting volunteers, and then they will actually be able to organically rise through the ranks and become an actual established brigade. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.